This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video is part 1 covering lectures 13 to 24 from Seminar 4. The final section of Seminar 4 extensively examines Freud's famous case study on phobia, centering on a little boy named Hans. Lacan's analysis will provide insight into the case itself and a theoretical perspective on the structural elements of phobias and what implications this has for the psychoanalytic approach to signifiers more generally. Rather than move section by section as I've done with these seminars up till now, I'll move from concept to concept. The reason for this is that first, there's a good deal of redundancy that might be avoided without hopefully sacrificing too much depth. Second, it remains challenging to understand what Lacan is saying without looking ahead. Lacan unfolds concepts in a methodical manner that builds upon previous lectures, and he avoids hasty generalizations. However, this leads to his discussions on a given concept in a lecture to feel highly incomplete and vague without taking into account the whole of his analysis within a seminar. At the same time, because I might pass over some sections for the sake of focusing on the bigger picture, I do invite any who are following along with the text itself to raise questions about particular parts to see if we can together get at an even deeper understanding of the text. In this first video for this section of Seminar 4, we'll review the case of little Hans and take up the function of castration, which plays a pivotal role in Lacan's conception of the phobia. Our knowledge about the case of little Hans is mainly provided by his father, who was interested in psychoanalysis and would visit Freud to speak with him about his son and to receive guidance on how to address the challenges that Hans was facing. In a certain sense, the father played the role of his son's psychoanalyst, with Freud as the clinical supervisor. Hans is even aware that his father is reporting to Freud and sometimes will even evoke the professor in conversations with the father. Now, we might already see here some problems with this setup, and perhaps for this reason, Lacan opts to call this an observation rather than an analysis proper. At an early age, Hans becomes very curious about his penis, or what he will call his whittler. Not only is he curious about his whittler, but others' whittlers as well. His father's, mother's, animals, his baby sisters. Lacan writes, "Little Hans was constantly fantasizing the phallus, questioning his mother about the presence of her phallus, then about his father's phallus, then about the phallus of animals. He speaks about nothing but the phallus. The phallus is truly the pivotal object, the central object in the organization of his world." As Hans's parents had fairly liberal parenting attitudes, especially for that time, they were generally supportive and non-shaming toward his interest. Hans's relationship with his mother was particularly close, perhaps a little too close, and in such a manner that was a source of tension between his parents. However, at some point, Hans discovers the enjoyment he can obtain from his whittler and starts playing with it in a fairly exhibitionistic manner. One time when doing this, the mother told Hans to stop and said that if he continued, she would send him off to a doctor to cut it off. Also around this time, about age 3.5, his baby sister Hannah is born. To satisfy his curiosity about the birth of his little sister, Hans's father tells him about the story of the stork and how it delivers babies. The story begins, however, not to hold much water for Hans, but lacking the necessary concept about sex and biology to organize his experiences, he begins fashioning his own stories and fantasies to fill in the gaps of his understanding, exemplified by his later focus on lumps, his word for excrement, which he compares to babies, perhaps as a way to construct an understanding of where babies come from, since that stork story failed to support his experience. Then around age 4.5, he developed a fear of horses, specifically that they would bite him if he raised his hand to one. This fear includes the added remark about the blackness around the horse's mouth. Hans will also become afraid of horses falling when a particular loading cart turns. This fear of horses, of their biting and falling, eventually turns into a compulsion for Hans to look at them. Keeping these elements of the case in mind, and there are others to be addressed as we proceed, we can now take up the major concepts Lacan develops in this final part of Seminar 4, tying them to this case when it makes sense to do so. However, I should add that while the case of Little Hans provides some of the concrete material for thinking through these concepts, Lacan is aiming to demonstrate the structural dimension of phobias in general, and even more broadly to characterize how signifiers move, transform, and how they become linked to signifieds in a manner that has implications for all clinical and normative structures. As such, I'll be less interested in trying to justify some of the specific interpretations made in this case, not all of which is always clear to me, and instead be much more focused on the broader implications derived from these interpretations. Let's return to this chart, now filled out by Lacan. As mentioned in previous videos, the object relation is a relation to a lack of an object. Depending on if we are dealing with the registers of real, symbolic, or imaginary, lack will entail frustration of a real object, privation of a symbolic object, or castration of an imaginary object, unfolding in that order in a quasi-developmental manner, though frustration and privations are only clinically encountered through the retroactive effect of castration. Finally, each of these modes of lack will be enacted by a particular agent. The child's earliest relation, typically given the title of mother, is the first element of reality to be symbolized by that child. Indeed, the child will first experience the breast, or that source of material sustenance, as a real object, but not initially the agent who can give it. Only once frustrations are experienced are such an agent posited. In other words, an absence gives rise to a signifier representing the mother as the first symbolic big other. In becoming aware of the mother in this manner, the real object of the breast will undergo a symbolic transformation in the form of the mother's love. And herein there forms a primordial dialectic between mother and child, whereby the child will begin fashioning gifts, often products of bodily functions, that go on to acquire a symbolic value for the child and thus are thought to be exchanged for the mother's love. However, there are inevitable failures here, as at some point those gifts are no longer acceptable and the mother is experienced as a desiring agent herself who seeks after something that the child in fact cannot give, some X factor beyond the child. Here is where the child experiences a real privation. The mother fundamentally lacks something which she can only obtain elsewhere. And it will be the uncertainty around whether or not the mother has a phallus that will take up much of Hans's questioning early on in the case. The privation is real because there is truly something absent, but the object that is absent is symbolic because there is no real penis to go missing for the mother. And so now the mother who is deprived of her enjoyment can, for the child, then vacillate between a mother who extracts that enjoyment she seeks from the child, who will stand in for the imaginary phallus, and a wrathful mother who is terrifying in her disappointment at being unable to extract that enjoyment from that kid. It will be here where tremendous anxiety emerges for Hans as he is forced to come to terms with this new reality. The relation between Hans and his mother might be rightfully characterized as an enmeshed one. At the same time, this mother becomes someone who comes to reject his offerings, such as when he is reprimanded for playing with his whittler in front of her. But also once his little sister arrives and becomes a source of competition for the mother's love, a position that often the imaginary father will take as well, but we'll say more about that in the next video. It's at this point that we can see where the fetish and phobia enter in, but in different ways. The fetishistic object serves as a way of veiling the mother's privation. What makes the shoe or garment appealing is that it hides something that in fact is not there and never was there. But with the support of the fetishistic object, the fantasy of something being there can be maintained. And this takes on various forms as the subject identifies sometimes with the phallus and sometimes with the mother. The phobic object will enter here for a different reason. It will function as a strategy for dealing with the overwhelming anxiety faced in this new situation. Because such anxiety is so overwhelming and encompassing, the child finds a means of navigating this terrifying condition through an object that can concentrate and localize the source of this anxiety. Now, why is it that the phobic object arises sometimes and not at other times? Well, the ordinary unfolding of the Oedipus complex entails the child coming to terms with castration. And the possibility of castration is introduced by the intervention of the real father. The real father is the one who enters and breaks up the dialectic between mother and child, demanding that the child give up trying to be the imaginary phallus for the mother, to become castrated, for the promise of something bigger and better. To give up this imaginary object, to become castrated, then entails being made to give up our narcissistic fantasies of being whole and being able to complete others. The child is thus presented with a fundamental and highly consequential choice. Continue trying to be the imaginary phallus for the mother, or give up the game altogether. If the latter is chosen, the child receives a new signifier, the name of the father, that will allow for a reorganization of the child's experience, a reconfiguration of imaginary relations, and a repression of that traumatic anxiety that would have otherwise prevented the child from fully entering into a shared symbolic world. As such, the intervention of the real father opens the possibility for a relationship with the symbolic father, the big other, who will serve as a central point of orientation going forward. This notion of castration is a bit confusing, since we don't usually apprehend this lack in an experiential manner. Instead, symbolic castration enters our experience as a real privation, a hole in our own existence through which we encounter a lingering sense of incompleteness in ourselves, that something is fundamentally missing. Lacan states, "There is a share of beings in humanity who are, as it is put in the text, castrated." The term is, of course, utterly ambiguous. They are castrated in the subjectivity of the subject. In reality, when it comes to what they are in the real, and which is invoked as a real experience, they are deprived. And we probably could add to this that how we often understand this real privation will most often be in terms of frustration. So what I gather from this is that we have to be cautious not to think of the different registers of lack in either linear or mutually exclusive terms. One can't speak of castration without reference to privation and frustration, but it is also the case that the path to accessing our castration often first comes through our ability to articulate privation and frustration. Now, an analogy came to mind about how to think about castration here. So imagine I'm a child with play money. I pretend I can buy real things with it. However, one day I hit up against the real world and discover that, in fact, I can't buy anything with this play money, that all my so-called purchases were just products of my fantasy life. Consequently, to truly get what I want, I'm going to have to give up my pretend play money and resign myself to become somebody's employee with the promise that I'll get what I want someday, as long as I work really hard. But what do I want? So-called real money? Well, no, but what I actually want is what money can buy. Money itself is deprived of any substance. It is a signifier marking an absence. But as an employee, I often experience this privation as frustration. A boss who's withholding money from me and making me work harder than I should have to. Similarly, castration takes place with an imaginary object which must be given up in the child's fantasy life as the entrance fee, so to speak, into the adult world. And just as the real world intervenes to require my giving up play money, so it is the real father whose intervention introduces castration into the equation. It will be the symbolic father who can provide what the real father has taken away. Now, whereas psychosis forecloses upon this possibility of castration and perversion disavows castration by veiling it, the phobia is an attempt to establish a castrating agent who can offer a signifier that functions in a manner that the real father was supposed to, such as the understanding of what happens in the case of little Hans. Now, while thinking through this, a personal experience recently happened that struck me as having a similar structure to what's going on here between castration and phobias. So I had an interaction with my 8-year-old daughter the other day. We have a nightly ritual prior to putting her to sleep in which we watch a show we both very much enjoy. However, there have been times in which she gets distracted and behind on a few responsibilities. The time gets late and we're just not able to watch the show that evening. The other day, she was in a sort of panic that we lost out on our time to watch the show, even though there in fact remained plenty of time to do so. The response got elicited only once I entered the kitchen to grab a glass of water, something I typically do right before I go upstairs to watch the show with her. My grabbing a glass of water somehow served as a trigger for her reaction. And at that moment, I realized that I actually never adequately established a structure, a set of parameters that can make things more predictable for her. I had in my mind a specific time that we needed to start by, but I never made it fully explicit to her. So in the absence of a clear law, she went on to create her own, one that both led her to a moment of panic, but also manufactured some structure in her experience, which was perhaps far better than the anxious uncertainty that was otherwise present. So it was at this point I told her the time we needed to start by, and that so long as she is ready by then, we'll have time to watch her show. Now, although this is a rather banal example, we can perhaps see a function at play that is similar to what happens in the emergence of the phobic object. There's some enjoyment that she was afraid of losing out on or would be taken away from her. And to manage the anxiety, she creates something that will both elicit fear, but interestingly lower her anxiety. Now, notably, once I established a clear rule, the real father intervening to bring a signifier, that being the time in which we are to start our nightly ritual, both the anxiety and the fear were greatly attenuated. And perhaps we can infer from this that what we demand is some kind of master, and that being castrated by the imposition of a law is often a far more welcome situation for many of us than the alternative, and hence for the need for a phobic object when no such law is readily imposed on us. But to better consider how this is so, the next video will explore the concept of the father and the function of the signifier in myth, metonymy, and metaphor. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. And as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.